David Landsman, who's going to be the chair for this panel, and we will hopefully have time for a short Q&A at the end. But for now, David, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good afternoon, and it's I had fun this morning telling everybody I was going to be coming to the zoo, and they all looked at me and they said, "Why are you coming to the zoo?" And I said, "Oh, it's very serious, a very serious event," and it's a very serious topic because we're all committed to sustainability in one way or another, but the question in my mind is, do we really know what it is and what we can do about it? Now, I am probably somewhat at the older end of the average at this event, and certainly when I was the age of some of the people around here, we hadn't even heard of the word sustainability, wouldn't have had a clue what sustainability was. But even if you've grown up with the idea of sustainability, there's still a lot, if you like, of bad habits, a lot of muscle memory out there, which makes it quite difficult, I think, to get your mind around what we actually do about sustainability. How do we understand it? How do we understand the challenges at home and around the world? And what do we actually do about it? And we've got a really good, diverse panel here today, and one more to fly in, I suspect, at the last minute, to talk about what we actually do, how we become more aware of the challenges at home and around the world, and what we can do ourselves to make a difference. We have Angela Terry, the founder and CEO of One Home, who is an absolute expert on sustainability awareness, and with her Duygu Gozeler Porchet, who has been supporting One Home. We have my colleague Luisa Edves from British Expertise International, and we support British organisations working in education and international development around the world, and that's exactly what Luisa does, and I'm sure she'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And with a real example of a project which is helping with education and ultimately then with sustainability around the world, Antonia Hill, who is one of this year's RISE winners, and I think you've already heard from some of those and probably hearing from a few more. So she's got a real, live, rather exciting project to talk to us about. And we have one more panelist, Sophie Malby, from the wonderful Coalition for Global Prosperity, one of our partners, who is struggling to get here through the London traffic, which itself is a sustainability challenge. And she'll say a little bit more about her work later on. I think time to turn to Antonia first, and what do we really do to become more sustainable, and how do we understand the challenge?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to first start by introducing myself a bit more and talk about my project, and I'll then try to move into the sustainability direction from that. So I am Antonia, and I'm a part of RISE, which is essentially an initiative by Eric Schmidt and Wendy Schmidt with the Rhodes Trust and Schmidt Futures to detect talent across the world. And essentially, each year they pick 100 people from the ages of 15 to 17 who have projects and ideas that benefit society and that need support. So my project, which I applied to RISE with, was on dyslexia and helping children with learning differences. I myself have dyslexia, and I really struggled with that in school, and especially elementary school was extremely challenging for me. So I essentially created a platform for children who have dyslexia but maybe don't have support from parents and other people in their lives to essentially get the support they need to thrive in school. And it's really interesting being here today at this panel because you probably would not think that literacy and sustainability have a lot in common, but I actually would argue that they do. And I am, excited to talk about it further today and see what other people have to say as well. And also I'm excited to be here today as a Gen Z person to maybe also like offer a different perspective on things. And yeah, I'm happy to be here and talk more later this panel.
Antonia, thank you very much, and thank you for reminding me that I'm definitely not a Gen Z person. No, really interesting, and welcome to Sophie. Well done for getting here through the London traffic. Let's turn now to Angela and to Duygu to talk to us a little bit about sustainability awareness and what you've built up.
Yeah, thank you. So basically, if you ask people in a poll, are they worried about climate change? Nearly everyone will say yes, because we're talking about having a world that is going to sustain human life, and people tend to love their children and their grandchildren. So undoubtedly, people care about the subject. If you then ask them what they're doing to tackle climate change, reduce their carbon emissions, and prevent runaway global warming, they will say, I do my bit, I do recycling. And unfortunately, recycling is a very low impact measure in terms of reducing carbon footprints. So there is a big education gap around what is the most impactful actions we can all take. And so our main phrase is raise your voice, cut your carbon. And then we go through and tell people how they can stop using oil and gas, because basically the less we burn oil and gas, the less impacts we will see. But the other thing we do is we talk to people about how they can stay safe. So 1 in 5 homes are at high risk of flooding in the UK. We've had 40-degree heat in the UK, and we're starting to have wildfires in the UK, which are disproportionately impacting the poorest people the most, who have done the least. So it's about cutting your carbon footprint, but it's also increasing resilience. But crucially, the way we get the message out is where people naturally see and read their information. So I write a weekly column called Going Green that appears across all National World's papers. They are one of the biggest media, and people trust their local papers more than they do, say, Facebook or Twitter. So it's about where you put the message, who you give it to, but also trusted voices. And so as a scientist, we tend to be independent, impartial, we base it on evidence. There is an awful lot of very well-funded disinformation out there. And so it is about getting ahead of that disinformation, because unfortunately, if people hear something, they tend to, it doesn't matter how many times you try and counter it with factual information, it's like Velcro, it's stuck to their brain. So that's why putting the information about what we can do, the climate solutions that work for people, and generally save them money, and in a cost of living crisis, it's all about money. That's the most important thing we can do, really, is to tell the truth, get the information to the people who need it, who can act, and there is something we can all do. You don't have to be rich to be doing your part on climate change. So that's what One Home is set up to do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, first of all, thank you very much for Russia, first of all, to you and to you, David, for having this amazing conference. My name is Duygu Gozeler. Maybe a quick background information about myself. I spent all my career in international investment banking. I worked all around the globe, mainly with large institutional investors and large corporates, doing traditional financing, let's say. And about almost 4 or 5 years ago, I decided to transition into sustainable investing, which is basically mobilizing capital into impact-driven businesses. So I try to help early stage and later stage businesses with their fundraising. And I will tie to what Angela talked about, the gap in education. I think the most important impact of environmental education gap is the funding gap. Because we're not aware, we don't invest enough. And I will give you some data for that. Currently, every year we invest about $1.3 trillion into climate-related investments. And when you hear this number, $1.3 trillion, it sounds a lot, and it is a big number indeed, and I think we have come a long way compared to the previous years. But if you look at what we're trying to achieve by 2030, and when we say 2030, we're talking about the next 5 years, which is quite near, so we don't really have much time. Experts say that we need to raise about $7 to $9 trillion every year to meet our net zero targets, which are set by the Paris Agreement. So we have a large funding gap. We need to increase our investment by nearly 5-fold. This brings us to the question, why can't we raise enough money for climate change? As Angela said, we know, and everyone is aware, that this is the most important crisis humanity is facing right now. It is impacting everyone's lives. Every day we hear news. Just a few days ago, we heard the news coming from Valencia, Spain. We face it every summer here in England, the heat waves, wildfires, floods. So it is a big problem, but we are not taking it seriously. And I think it's a bit of a systemic problem that we need to face. It starts from the very top, at the government level, and it goes all the way down to an average person on the street. We are all stakeholders, and I think the responsibility is shared by everyone. And I hope that we will talk more about it, but I will end my words here. But basically, what we are trying to do is increase funding to climate projects so that we can all do what we need to do for the next generation, the generation sitting in this room. And we should all feel that responsibility on our shoulders.
Thank you very much. I think your reference to Spain there was very interesting, because if we move from the very local, and we talked about recycling a bit, but and all the other things we might be doing, but actually this is a global problem. It's not just a local problem, and the temperature here might go up to 40 degrees very occasionally, but that's not the whole scale of the challenge. So we need to look also at the international dimension, and I'll turn to Luisa to say a few words there, as British expertise focuses very much on the international dimension.
Thank you very much, David. Welcome. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be speaking today, and be speaking by something that is very, very close to my heart, and that's international development. So I am lucky enough to work in an organization, as David was mentioning, with some of the largest organizations in the world that actually build projects of sustainability, whether that's looking into climate change, education, humanitarian work, healthcare, economic growth, governance. We are most of the time at the forefront of the discussions of innovation, how to create more impact. However, one thing that strikes me in the discussions and hearing the other panelists, what does sustainability actually mean? And I encourage every single of you in this room to think for 5 seconds, what does it mean for you? And I'm 100% everyone will have their own answer to it, because sustainability is a broad subject. What does it mean for me? It's innovation, diversity, equity, inclusion. And I was literally just probably 30 minutes ago into the room next door, listening to one of the workshops on the mentees, and one of the questions was, who would you be in 5, 10, 25 years from now? What would you like to change in the world? And it's a very interesting thing, because the concept of international development and impact is looking back in time, and looking back where we are now, 25 years from now. Even 4 years ago, when I did my master's in social inclusion and sustainability, things change so rapidly, and I think the key is understanding from each other. It's not necessarily what we consider is the right thing, it's adapting with the local knowledge. So looking at very, very big trends coming from even the agenda of the British government when it comes to international development, the agenda of the American government, UN, the World Bank, etc. It's a very big push into gathering local knowledge. And there is a lot of information, a lot of studies, and even the paper that we recently published at British Expertise International, looking into ways of doing impact. Impact comes from the core. Impact comes from the people that are actually experiencing things. What we can do is create those contexts. And I think Antonia had an absolutely incredible example of being one of the people that actually needed a change. So creating a platform where that voices can be heard and giving power to those people, I think that is the key of sustainability. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. And I'm going to turn to Sophie. And I did say before you arrived that the Coalition for Global Prosperity is a wonderful organisation, but I didn't say anything more about it than that. So given you an opening as the warm up, as it were, but now you can tell us a little bit about Coalition
That's
for
all
Global
anyone needs
Prosperity,
to know
please.
about us. So I work for an organisation called the Coalition for Global Prosperity, and my job, basically, in layman's terms, is to translate to MPs, members of Parliament, why international development is so important. And obviously, with political divides in Parliament, as you'd expect, it's working out how we translate that to people. So one of the criticisms we hear a lot from Conservative MPs is that international development, sustainability, climate change, they're all a bit left-wing for them. It's all a bit, it's not their red meat, it doesn't land on their doorsteps, they're trying to get re-elected. So a lot of what we do is actually giving them the language and the understanding of how much international development really fits within any political niche. And so you see a lot of the time that we are maybe having a conversation about climate change with Labour MPs, and we're saying, actually, this is good for the entire world. But when we're having that same conversation with Conservative MPs, we're talking about, well, if you stabilise these countries, if we make it so that they have access to water, they aren't experiencing these droughts and these heat waves, well, then there's going to be less refugees, maybe, and there's going to be better trading relations. So a lot of what we do is making sure that we're kind of giving them the initial understanding to kind of just even slightly engage with us. And we then take a lot of these MPs out to visit Aid in Action across the globe. And the realization on a lot of these MPs' face when they see a bag of grain with UK aid on it, or they meet someone from the Halo Trust who is demining, and they realize the impact that we are having is so, so incredible, and they become such advocates for what we do, even if it's just privately. But a lot of what we actually have to do starts with a bit of an education. And when we're talking about places like Valencia, my parents currently live in Spain, so I've had lots of texts from people checking they're okay. But it is incredibly scary because I think for a long period of time, people have been able to think that climate change is something that happens in the Saharan desert, it happens in the ice caps. And I think it's now becoming very clear that it's happening here, it's happening where we live, it's happening in what we all like to think of as developed countries. And we're all going to have to at some point pull together. And funding is going to be such a tricky thing for that. We've obviously just seen the budget, and we're still reeling from that, I think everyone is. But it's how we then make sure that we're all advocating for stuff with these MPs, and we're making sure that they're educated enough about it to understand the decisions they're making.
Thank you very much, Sophie. I'm going to ask a few questions and then open up to see who else would like to ask a question, but I'm going to take advantage first of all. Antonia, perhaps you'd like to tell us a little bit more about the project that you're working on, and I'd be really interested in hearing about some of the tangible benefits you see to improved literacy. I mean, we all know they're kind of there, but what do they feel like? What do they look like?
Okay, so my project, well, originally the project I submitted to RISE was called the Students Reading for Students project. So initially what happened was, when I was a child, I learned very well to learn how to read through having other people read stories to me and essentially have their finger follow the words they're reading, because people who are dyslexic like me have a lot of problems with phonetics. So that really helps kind of like put the words and the sounds of words together. So I thought it would be a great idea to kind of like do these videos myself of me reading stories and publish them on a platform which I made. And I originally just started off doing these videos in German and English because these are the only languages I could speak myself. But then I realized actually it'd be really cool to have it in a lot more languages, because a big problem with education is that it's not very accessible, and that also a lot of education resources are very much focused on the English-speaking world. I think that also goes with climate education. A lot of that is focused on English demographics. So I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done there. But going back to my project, I thought it would be a great idea to have essentially as many reading videos as possible from as many different languages as possible. And since I went to an international school, I thought I'd make use of that, and I asked as many of my classmates as possible to help me record videos for this project. And we ended up getting over 20 different languages, which was really, really cool. So we had reading videos in languages such as Chinese, but then we also had Telugu, we had Portuguese, so many different, people were willing to help me in the project, which was absolutely amazing. But currently I am taking this project to next level, and I have collaborated with another RISE winner to essentially make a app which targets dyslexic children from especially less socioeconomic developed backgrounds who maybe don't have parents who can support them with their reading difficulties, or teachers who can properly help them during school. So it's modeled off the Duolingo model, and it essentially tries to help children learn how to read via gamified learning, so with small games and small exercises to really tackle their reading difficulties. And it would be absolutely amazing if this could also be maybe more in the sustainability education area in the future, because I think a big problem, especially Gen Z, is that a lot of people, even like my age, don't quite understand what the problems are that we're going to be facing in the future. So it would be very beneficial, I think, if we could also kind of like tackle how to address the next generations earlier on sustainability, and maybe communicate sustainability education in potentially gamified models as well in the future. That's just something to throw out there. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely. I mean, it strikes me as a fascinating opportunity. I mean, we've seen how in the developing world, mobile telephones, the use of them has spread so much and has been such a game changer in terms, for example, of financial inclusion. And if you can partner, perhaps you already are, with the right sort of mobile telephone providers and some of the people who are already using the networks for so many good things around the world, then I'm sure you can scale what you're doing really well. It sounds really exciting. I love the idea of it being done in so many different languages. That's absolutely great. Thank you very much, Antonia. Angela, we were talking about recycling as being kind of low impact. I guess you don't find, as you say, too many people these days who say there isn't a climate problem or they're not interested. But I guess the risk the other way around is it all gets so overwhelming. Where do you possibly start? What do you actually do? How can I possibly make a difference? What's your answer to that? And what are the specifics you would be focusing on?
Yeah. Thank you. I think the key thing is that if everyone says, what can I do, then we end up doing nothing. And I think that's happened a lot in climate change, because everyone's like, oh, there's 100 corporations are responsible for 75% of emissions and things like this. So the way to mobilize everyone is to say, if you know this is a problem and you care, why wouldn't you do everything you can to help? And so what can you do to help? Well, it's raise your voice. ultimately, we just had a budget where they put up bus fares by 50%, but they froze fuel duty for about I don't know how many years it's been now, at the same time that they settled out of court for that beautiful little girl that died in London from air pollution, whilst promising to improve air pollution for all children in London. We know what we need to do, but the politicians still aren't going far and fast enough. And we've also seen a lot of the corporations row back. So I don't know if you remember when Shell and BP did a beauty parade to pretend they cared about climate change. They've since changed their mind and aren't pretending anymore. But like, we have to tackle the fact that the polluters aren't paying. We currently, the taxpayers in the UK, actually fund the decommissioning of oil wells in the North Sea for them. And I think BP's or Shell's profits this quarter was over £4 billion. So these are companies that are making vast amounts of money by destroying the planet for everyone, yet the people who are suffering most have had hardly any carbon footprint. So the number one thing is raise your voice, because if you don't talk about it, silence is deadly, basically, and a common problem remains a common problem unless it's well known, basically. So we have to talk more about climate change. We don't even need to use the words climate change. People are really worried about their energy bills. People talk about their cars all the time, their holidays all the time, what they're having for their dinner. So all the solutions are out there, they're actually really affordable. So whether it's diet and eating food that's not mass produced and that has more vegetarian or vegan type protein in it, or whether it's insulating your home so it feels warmer and cozier, it also puts the value of your house up and it lowers your energy bills. And in terms of transport is the biggest source of carbon emissions in the UK. And it's things like walking a bit more, cycling a bit more. Electric scooters are actually illegal in the UK, but the highest amount of four-wheel drives are in Kensington and Chelsea Borough here in London. So we have this thing where it's okay for people to drive almost tanks around London, but you can't have an electric scooter. So there's loads of things that we can change quite quickly, but the main thing we need to do is put a carbon tax on the pollution so that the polluters start to pay, and that money is ring-fenced to the people who are actually having the impacts of climate change, whether that's their homes are flooding or their crops are ruined or whatever the impacts are, because we know they're going to get worse. But I think the key thing is people aren't being asked to take these measures, and that's where this public information and education campaign is so desperately needed, because if you don't help people make those choices, then they tend to switch off and do nothing. And that we've seen amazing things happen very quickly when the right policies are in place. And I'll give you one example, because we have done fantastically. We are one of the main, I think we are the main offshore wind farm developers in the world. And we're exporting all that expertise now around the world. And so things can happen very quickly, and that's where I say to people there is so much hope. The next things we need to do are electric vehicles, and there's now over 1 million on our roads, and that's with all the disinformation against them. So once people drive them, they're a superior product, and they're also cheaper to run and cheaper to operate. So it's a win-win-win, basically, if we can get people to adopt faster. So for net zero, which is for the UK, it's legally binding. By 2050, the UK are going to not contribute anymore to climate change. I think it's about 60 or maybe even more % of those policies require change in consumer behaviour. So it does involve not just the early uptakers who wanted a Tesla because they're cool people and have lots of money. It involves everyone getting on board with the transition to clean energy. But our grid, our electricity grid, has already been decarbonised, and I'm not sure if people know, but the last coal-fired power station closed down last month. So that transition is happening. Where we do it well, we do exceedingly well. Businesses invest and the public get on board. We just need to be going so much faster.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Angela. I want to turn to Luisa and to Sophie together, in a sense, and ask them the same question and see whether they agree, because our organisations are such good friends. But there's so much you could do in sustainability, and there's so many different dimensions to it, and we see a lot of them at British Expertise. We know there are pressures, and it's in the UK and elsewhere, on funding on projects. What are the priorities? Where do you start? What do you, if you've got to choose, where do you start?
I think oh. It's a very interesting approach, and probably I'll just take the recent paper that we actually produced at British Expertise International, which is called Gender Equality and Social Inclusion. And probably, I looked at Sophie because we actually were quite close together. We input quite a lot of what's happening on the ground and impact from companies that are working on the daily basis in different countries, focusing on different challenges, and we input into government. So how it actually started, and David was mentioning before, is the cuts in budgets and not having the same amount of money or not enough money to fund what we have to fund and address the challenges we're seeing on a daily basis. So mostly we're looking, for a lot of our members, we're looking at impact and how we can make the use of what we have at the moment and the cuts in budget in order to make sure we are delivering the biggest impact. So we came up with this framework which looks at at four main angles of providing the most impact, which we encourage not just governments but also people that are working in the field to approach. So the first and probably the most challenging to do is the top-bottom approach. So making sure you have government funders, funding organizations on board with the understanding of the impact sustainability. So and that's kind of like where I work quite a lot with Sophie, into making sure we input a lot into British politicians on how to approach and how to build up policies in order to make sure it allows flexibility for organizations to deliver in a way that's more understandable for the social context of different countries in which they operate in. The other one is the bottom-up approach. So as I was previously mentioning, the understanding of local needs. So not having that Western agenda and knowing, well, this is what we do, this is what we've done for certain years, this is the right way. No, there is diversity, there is innovation, and we need to be very aware of that. We need to understand that the change happens locally and the local people have power. We need to give them back the power. So it's having that approach when it doesn't matter where the funding comes, doesn't matter who the project implementers are, who the technical experts are. The bank of knowledge sits in the local community, and that's the second thing that we're focusing on. The other thing is more on the logistics on how to deliver projects, so making sure the inclusion, sustainability is not just a tick box. And I think probably looking at the things that are happening around us, probably climate change is just a tick in the box. And Angela, you were just mentioning about BP and Shell using a lot of greenwashing money into, just ticking the boxes. Yeah, we are doing something, but actually, does that have an impact? So it's looking at different structures on bidding processes, type of funding, project management, making sure that at every single stage there is that anchoring thing that provides impact. The later one is obviously the funding, which we do not have much access to, and obviously I think with every single month and week, we're seeing more and more challenges. And of course, these challenges not just necessarily looking at climate, economic inclusion, but also looking at instability all around the world, and unfortunately divides the world in different thoughts, different ways of being, different ways of approaching. So it's understanding how we are making the best use of the funding that that we're facing. So for example, right now where we're trying to bring into the UK agenda to to boost impact is working with organizations such as yours, which we take private capital, but in the same time match it with the UK taxpayers' money that go into international development. However, that's not where we only stop. We look at the World Bank institutions, we look as well as other bilateral donors from the US, Australia, and how we can actually come all of us together into delivering even bigger, most impactful and at-scale projects. So these are kind of like the 4 dimensions from my side.
Yeah, thank you, Luisa. Sophie?
I think she covered the funding off there pretty well, but would be something that I would have at the top as well. One of the biggest challenges we're facing, and that we did not get very much clarity on in the budget, is currently we are about 0.5% gross national income is going to funding international development aid. That has been cut from 0.7, which was, we were the first G7 country to hit 0.7, and then we almost immediately cut it. We were hoping to get back to that, but we know it's probably slightly unsustainable in the current environment, but that is, what I think the entire sector is looking at. The biggest drain on international development funding right now is that a lot of the Home Office is taking the funding for migration and asylum seekers in the UK from our development budget. So we've got a ring-fenced fund to deliver this amazing work around the world, to stabilize countries, to help protect women and girls, to secure water and food for people, and we are spending it on Premier Inns. Obviously, we need to spend that money, but if it's ring-fenced, it should be ring-fenced properly. They have said that they're going to try and cut that down in the budget, but there is no steps or information on how they are planning on doing that. So that's going to be something that we're keeping a really close eye on. Funding, we recently did an event with Bill Gates in Parliament, and one of the things he said is that post-COVID, there was 20 years of really sustained growth and work towards international development, and post-COVID it has fallen off a cliff. And he is now spending most of his time trying to push to get that back. Really inspiring guy, the stuff he does at the foundation, but like Bill Gates is having to be out here. Like, okay, COVID was like 4 years ago. Come on, let's get on it. Let's get back to where we were. The other thing I think that's really important is the education side of things. The thing we struggle the most with from MPs, from prospective MPs, special advisors, people in politics, is understanding of the process, that actually stabilizing a country first, rather than letting it get to the point it needs humanitarian aid, is a really good way of making sure we resolve the problems before they reach our shores. Because they will. We're a very globally connected world. Like, everything is going to have an impact. Russia invades Ukraine, our energy bills go up. That is the prime example of how much this stuff affects us, even if it's thousands of miles away. The US election will have a huge impact on the international development aid sector, more than the election here did. There's a long-termism that is missing in politics in general, but especially in international development aid. If it doesn't have a result in 5 years that they can use on a leaflet or at the ballot box, they're not interested in doing it. And we have to try and get away from that, not only for development aid, not only for education, but also for things like climate change, where if they can't say they ticked it off, they don't want to do it. And despite, any thoughts on Rishi Sunak, he gave himself 5 things he was going to do, and he made good progress towards all of them, but he didn't tick them all off, so it wasn't enough. And so that removing this kind of short-term, 5-year electoral kind of churn of policies and just getting it done just is going to be the biggest thing we have to tackle from a political side of actually dealing with a lot of these bigger issues.
Thank you very much, Sophie. My last question to Duygu, and I'm hoping you're going to cheer us up. What prospects do you see for impact investing? I mean, it's grown a lot over recent years. How fast is it going to evolve?
Well, I mean, I'll try to be optimistic, but I actually, before going to that question, I want to also talk about the short-termism in the investment and business space as well. I mean, if you look at an average tenor of a CEO of a publicly traded company, it is around 10 years. So it's 5 to 10 years. So they don't really care much beyond that horizon. And going back to the impact investing, most of these innovations take time to return the money of the investors. So what you need is patient capital. You need innovative structuring solutions as well. So you need public and private capital together, blended finance solutions. And you need also tame people's greed a little bit. So you need to find investors, especially on the private client side, investors who are not prioritizing financial return initially, can look at a return of an investment both from an impact point of view and financial point of view. In one of the earlier panels, someone talked about leading with your heart, which I quite liked. And I would say investing with your heart is kind of, which will bring us to philanthropy. But I think impact investing is a good balance between investing and philanthropy. So you are basically managing two returns, so double returns. And I think in terms of what we're going to see, we will see a lot of innovations. I think I'm really, really hopeful from the university space, the companies coming up from universities. I think all the PhD students are looking into how to commercialize their amazing research, and I think there is good funding going there. And once investors can see that there is positive correlation between financial returns and sustainability, I think we will be in a great place, and hopefully we will bridge that funding gap that I talked to you earlier about. And finally, I think I didn't talk about the funding gap in the philanthropy side, which Angela knows the numbers much better than me. But if you look at the global grant money, it's about $3 billion every year that goes into general philanthropy. And climate-related charities only get less than 10% of it. And I think in the UK, it's around 7%. So I think I would like to raise awareness on that as well. When we are donating, we tend to donate to charities that we have direct impact. If we know someone who has suffered from cancer, we will go to cancer research. So I think we should think about climate as a topic that's going to impact everybody's life, and look into philanthropic giving from that angle as well. I don't know if you want to add anything, Angela. But.
Yeah, I think we have a window of about 10 years which are crucial to transform what we're currently doing from something that's minimal to something that's mainstream. And the will is there, the technologies are there, the economics are there. We have to raise our voices and we have to cut our carbon. And we can't do that without everyone working together. We love creating unusual partnerships. So if people want to come see me and talk about working with One Home, then I'll absolutely come have a chat afterwards. But basically, we're not going to get where we need to get, and it's irreversible. So this is really a big window that we have now, and it's up to all of us to set our sights on the prize, which is making sure that we keep the planet livable for the rest of the generations. And it is a win-win if we succeed. So we get to help the geopolitical situation if we have our homegrown energy, and we get people in healthier positions if they're not breathing in toxic air, and we get to have all these amazing opportunities. So I would say there's everything to fight for, and I just hope people take away something from our panel today. So thank you for inviting me to speak.
Thank you, Angela, and I think we have taken away a lot already. Are there any questions or comments from anyone? I can't see because of the light, but so you might have to jump up and down quite a lot to attract my attention or anyone's attention. But all I can see is a lot of light. But there's a question there, lady. Do we have to take mine?
Hi, good afternoon. That was it was lovely to hear from all of you actually, and some really thought-provoking things. My heritage is Barbadian, and I listened to Mia Motley, who is a leader in speaking on the impact of climate change in Barbados. And, you know, I'm thinking of my heritage, my family's future also. The fact that Barbados will be getting smaller and smaller and may just disappear is quite alarming. And I think that really impacts Barbadians and how Barbadians look at what's happening on an everyday basis, the beaches that are getting smaller and getting closer to the homes and homes disappearing off of the edges. But Barbados is also a place with people quite similarly to the UK, where people are living in, they're living quite low, close to the poverty line. They're living in survival mode. And I support a community in London that many people are living in survival mode, and they don't want to think about climate change. They're only thinking about right now, how do they put the food on the table, and keep the roof over their heads. How do we then really reach out to those people to help support them with their carbon footprint? Because the first thing they'll say is, I can't afford to get on a plane, so I'm not doing that. I can't afford a car, so I'm not doing that. I am using public transport. I am walking. Also, you know, I support some food banks, and we've had to then work with organisations called Mutual Aid, where they're actually growing food in spare gardens and spare pieces of land. They're growing vegetables to give to the food banks, because people that are accessing the food banks aren't getting vegetables. They're not getting those options. And also, just speaking from personal experience, I can cook a certain amount of things because that's what I grew up learning to cook. And I have diversified, you know, I'm trying. But also being able to change how people eat. That's a big long-term issue. You know, again, coming from a Caribbean community where diabetes is quite high because of the way we eat. When you've learnt what you've learnt and you make what you make, and, you know, it's a rush day, you come in, you sit down, and you think, gosh, what am I going to cook? You always refer to what you know, quick and easy. So how do we, myself and my organisation, I've got a small business, support those local people? That's my first question. Also, my company, we create beautiful spaces for community to engage in. And we're currently fitting out a space and constantly looking at how we create this beautiful, sustainable space that, you know, it starts, we didn't even have Cat A, basically it's just a shell. So really going in with how we create the space for the community that is, luxurious, because I believe community members from disadvantaged groups should have access to luxury, but also sustainable, and something that we can celebrate with the community and say, this is what you can have, you know, but it is sustainable. So how do I do those two things? Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, just before you start, we've probably got about 5 minutes left, so there might need to be brevity.
I think there was 5 questions in there as well, but that's perfect. That's
are you clear with the questions? So
yeah, no, that's wonderful. Thank you. I think the first thing is that the guilt needs to go. The people who have the lowest carbon footprints should not be shouldering this. It's something, this Oxfam does the stats every year, and it's like the richest 1% have a higher carbon footprint than 50% of the lowest income around the world. It is the private jets, it's the private yachts. It is really a wealth issue that is contributing significantly to climate change. So that then gets you into wealth distribution. That's a whole other panel. But you know, since COVID, we've seen the rich get much richer and the poor get much poorer. So it is about equality. The thing about food is brilliant for highlighting habits. We are creatures of habit, and it's how do you introduce that behavior change? And we saw it with COVID. You can introduce change, and I think it's about 14 times you have to do something over a couple of months before it becomes normal. And it's that thing about how do you get people out of cars? Well, you teach them how to ride and you give them a safe place to cycle. And before you know it, during COVID, the sales of electric cars and electric scooters went through the roof because A, it was cheaper, and B, people didn't have to go in the underground or buses. And once they start, they never want to go back into claustrophobic, germ-filled, noisy environments because they get their exercise and they get their kicks as well. So that whole, when I keep saying it's a win-win, I know it's cheesy, but it actually is. You know, the more we get people moving and eating better, the better it is, the cheaper it is, and the better it is for the environment. And then onto your community centre. We are a very wasteful society. My friend has just out-kitted a whole unit with the most cool furniture I think I've ever seen, and she got it nearly all free from recycling. There are loads of offices, corporate organisations. There'll be lots of them in London that will be able to deck out your place in a luxurious way that your community deserves, but that hopefully will stop things going to landfill and reuse, reduce, you know. So I wish you luck with that. But yeah, happy to talk to you more about sea level rise and coastal communities, because we actually have a project going on in that in the UK as well. But yeah, there's lots to talk about as ever.
Well, we've had a lot about challenges, but we end with a win-win, which sounds like a jolly good idea. Well, can I just thank our panel very much indeed. We have so many ideas to go away with. Sophie, Antonia, Luisa, Duygu, Angela, thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody.
Round of applause for our panelists.